I know that this is going to be old news because this news goes back a couple of weeks, but there's going to be a reboot of Anaconda, the movie that came out in 1997. For those that don't know, the 1997 movie was a creature feature that starred Jon Voight, Ice Cube, Jennifer Lopez, and a few others. I can't remember off the top of my head, but those were the three big ones in the 1997 horror movie. The 97 movie, while the critics absolutely ripped it apart, actually made money, and there were several sequels that were made that were actually made. You had Anaconda's Hunt for the Blood Orchid, I think is what the second one was called. Everyone just refers to it as Anaconda's, was released in 2004. And then ever since 2008, like Anaconda 3 onward, was all released to the Sci-Fi Channel. I actually didn't even realize that they made more Anaconda movies until I looked into it prior to the recording. That, oh wow, there were like 3 or 4 other Anaconda movies that I had never heard of, and the reason for that is because they all went to the Sci-Fi Channel. And then this news just came out a couple of days ago, where new Anaconda movie ensnares Thandie Newton, Steve Zahn, Selton Mello, who appears in Brazilian Awards season hopeful I'm Still Here, and Ione Skye have also joined the Columbia feature. Thandie Newton, who starred in HBO's acclaimed Westworld. Thandie Newton was also in Mission Impossible 2 all the way back in 2000. And Silo actor Steve Zahn has been in a lot of movies, have been swallowed up by Anaconda, Columbia's comedic reimagining of the 1997 horror movie that launched a mini franchise. Like I said, there were 2 theatrical films, and then the rest of the movies just released directly to the Sci-Fi Channel. Starting from like 2008, I think the series ran to like 2016, somewhere around there. Selton Mello, who appears in Brazilian Awards season hopeful I'm Still Here, and Ione Skye have also joined the feature that stars by Paul Rudd and Jack Black. Mello will be making his English language debut with the action comedy. Tom Gormican, who directed Nicolas Cage's meta movie The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, is co-writing with collaborator Kevin Eden and will direct the feature. The original movie starred Jennifer Lopez, Owen Wilson, Ice Cube, and Jon Voight. Okay, they put in one more name, was Owen Wilson. At least I remember Jennifer Lopez, Ice Cube, and Jon Voight. I only remember Jon Voight because he got eaten at the very end of the movie by the Anaconda, like squeezing the life out of him. And followed a National Geographic film crew hunting for the world's largest and deadliest snake, only to find the tables turn. That was the original movie. The news story, according to sources, involves a group of friends facing midlife crises who are remaking their favorite movie from their youth. They head to the rainforest only to find themselves in a fight for their lives against natural disasters, giant snakes, and violent criminals. Okay, that doesn't sound like Anaconda. It sounds like one of those remakes where it's like it's a remake in name only, but they could have called it something completely different, and it probably would have worked even better. Anyway, I'm not gonna call it early. Okay, I'm not that guy anymore. I'm not gonna call it early, but just from the sounds of it, it sounds like a remake in name only, which I know is going to run counterintuitive to my point, because I know you read the title before clicking on this, but I'm still gonna make but I still stand by the point. But anyway, let's finish up this article. Black will play an erstwhile director, a man stuck in his job as a wedding videographer, while Rudd will play an actor who did a stint on a cop show but sees his Hollywood dream slipping further and further away. Newton and Zahn are other childhood friends that join the two on the ill-fated adventure, while Mel will play a Brazilian animal wrangler. Skye is playing Black's wife. That's Ione Skye. The movie is now shooting in Australia, where it is being supported by the Queensland government through Screen Queensland's production attraction strategy. Fully formed the banner run by blah 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 blah. Okay, there's not any more to talk about. But the point that I wanted to make with this video is that while reboots generally are hated, rebooting horror movies, and I'll even extend this to like, the early science fiction movies of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, are actually the easiest to justify out of all the reboots. And I have 3 talking points that I wrote down to make my to make my argument for why rebooting horror movies or the low-budget science fiction of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s is a lot easier to justify than going back and remaking something like Miracle on 34th Street or a movie like Total Recall. And the first talking point I want to bring up is just changing technology. And I'm going to bring up this movie again. I know I've talked about it a lot since it came out, but Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, in my opinion, justifies itself because it is a remake of a 1922 German silent film. And Nosferatu is one of those horror movies that everyone has heard of. Or if you were like me and you grew up watching SpongeBob, you probably remember Count Orlok being worked into a plot of one of the episodes where SpongeBob and Squidward have to work the night shift at the Krusty Krab. I would show that little itty bitty clip, but Viacom CBS would probably strike this down because how dare you use a meme from SpongeBob, but if you use a meme from The Simpsons, Fox won't even touch you. But anyway, that's a whole different matter. But anyway, so yes, Count Orlok was actually worked into the plot. Now, they called him Nosferatu in the episode, except his name is actually Count Orlok, not Nosferatu. So, what I'm getting at is that, you know, if you sat down and you gave people a choice of, okay, you can watch Nosferatu right now if you really wanted to. The original German silent film has been in the public domain for decades. You could download it over the internet right now. I'm referring to the 1922 silent film, and it's perfectly legal. You can watch it right now. It's probably up on YouTube and various other video sharing sites. But how many people are going to say, you know what? I'm going to wait for the Robert Eggers movie to drop on digital, and that's when I'm going to watch Nosferatu, because the original Nosferatu is a silent film from the 20s, and silent films, to the vast majority of the film-loving public, are very, very boring. Okay, there's only 3 types of people that watch silent films. It's usually film school students, basically the academics, massive film buffs, or people that just want to put themselves to sleep. Right, so if you try to watch a silent movie all the way through a full feature silent film, I'm not talking about like Clara Bow films that were only like 20-25 minutes long. You're gonna find them very, very boring. I only ever watched one silent film in my life, and that was Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And god damn was that movie boring. And I had the unfortunate viewing experience of the version that had the lost, 45 minutes of the movie restored. So it was 2.5 hours of a silent movie. And good God, was it a slog to get through, at least for me. But that is most people when they watch silent films. So yes, the fact that Robert Eggers' Nosferatu has modern cinematography and obviously is going to look a lot better, but it also has sound, is going to really change people's perspective on the movie. Like I said, you can watch the original Nosferatu right now, through a video sharing site legally, the original 1922 German silent film. But most people aren't going to do that. They're going to wait for the Robert Eggers version to be available, because that is now being seen as the definitive version, because at least it isn't a silent movie. Okay, I think I've spent enough time on this. I think you get my point with changing technology and why horror and science fiction is very easy to justify rebooting. The second talking point I want to bring up is the fact if they're doing a contemporary reboot, right? Is that horror movies that were made in the 1930s reflect the 1930s. You could say the same thing for the low-budget science fiction films of the 1950s, in that they were made as a response to the nuclear age, right? And what is happening with all this nuclear technology, and that even extends to the monster movies. In fact, if you've ever seen Matinee with John Goodman, the movie that he was showing that movie, I think it was Mant, not a real movie, by the way, but a movie just like Mant would be made in the 50s to reflect the nuclear age. In fact, Godzilla was made as a reference to the nuclear age. But what a contemporary reboot will do is that they will take a movie that was made in the 1950s and very clearly made in the 1950s and try to bring it up to fit the modern day. And the best example I can personally think of this was the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still. The remake came out in 2008 that starred Keanu Reeves and Jaden Smith. Now I'm gonna be blunt with my opinion right here. The remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still is not great, but I understand what they were going for. It's just, again, it's not a great movie comparing it to the original. Comparing it to the original The Day the Earth Stood Still. If you watch the original The Day the Earth Stood Still, it was very clearly made for audiences of the 1950s, and there's a lot in that movie that reflects the sensibilities of the 1950s. Right, there's moments in that movie where there's like real debates as to whether or not the government should tell people about this invading aliens, something that would never happen today. Then you get to the 2008 Day the Earth Stood Still movie, and the response to the alien invasion is much different. It was we need to keep this absolutely top secret. It cannot leak out to the press, blah, 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 blah. The remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still was made to reflect a post 9/11 world, whereas the original from the 50s was made as a response to the creation of the nuclear bomb. Right, that's the difference. Okay, another contemporary remake that I can think of that is not horror or science fiction is a movie called The Manchurian Candidate. Most people probably don't even know that The Manchurian Candidate with Denzel Washington is actually a remake of a movie that came out in the 1960s. I believe it was 1962. It starred Frank Sinatra and it was called The Manchurian Candidate. The Manchurian Candidate was made as a reflection of the Cold War. It was made during the peak of the Cold War and clearly was made to reflect the sensibilities of the Cold War. So what did they do for the remake of The Manchurian Candidate? They brought it up into once again a post 9/11 world and the quote unquote war on terror. Now, granted, I believe that the remake with Denzel Washington is set during the first Gulf War, but that doesn't matter. You had filmmakers go back to remake a movie that was made during the Cold War, and obviously made with Cold War sensibilities, and it was remade to reflect more modern sensibilities and the war on terror. The contemporary remakes have always existed. Those are not going to go away. And another one that I can think of, and I promise that I'll move on after this. Another contemporary remake would be the Roger Corman classic film Piranha, directed by Joe Dante. That movie was remade twice. Most people only remember the 2010 remake that then had a sequel that was called Piranha Double D. Actually, it was called Piranha 3 Double D because the first movie was actually called Piranha 3D. Then it released a home video. They dropped the 3D from the title. And then when the sequel came out, it was called Piranha 3 Double D because it was in 3D. But once again, when it released a home video, they dropped the 3 and it's just called Piranha Double D. But again, most people know about that remake from 2010. What most people forget is that Piranha was remade in the 90s for the Showtime network. They went back and remade Piranha and just brought it up into the 1990s, and the 95 remake is notable for starring an up and coming Mila Kunis. But if you go back and you watch Piranha from 1978, it is very clearly a product of the 1970s. You're not getting around that. And so the contemporary remake is, okay, let's go back to this movie that we made in the 1970s that was clearly made for the 1970s, and we'll bring it up to the 1990s. That was the first remake. And then the second remake in 2010 was obviously made to reflect the sensibilities of the 2010s, even though it was a retro horror movie with the pointless nudity, obviously a nod to the horror movies of the 70s and 80s. You're not getting around the fact that the 2010 remake was also made for the sensibilities of the late 2000s, early 2010s. And my third talking point, which comes back to contemporary remakes, is very simple. What was scary to one generation is tame to another. Now, let me explain. This is actually a perfect example here. If you have ever seen the original Hellraiser movie, the first Hellraiser movie that came out in the late 80s, okay, that spawned a series, I believe, of 10 movies. I think it was 10 films that was spawned out of it. Anyway, there was a remake recently back in 2022. Okay, if you go back and you watch Hellraiser today versus watching in 1987, what most people complain about is that the original Hellraiser movie from 1987 is actually very tame by today's standards because of all the stuff that they had to cut out to achieve the R rating. Now, many people speculate that that Hellraiser would have held up better under Clive Barker's original cut, but we won't know that because Clive Barker's original cut of Hellraiser has never been released. But that is something where it's like what was considered, very sexy and very taboo back in the late 80s. Now, if you go back and watch it in the 2020s, is actually considered very tame. Yes, believe it or not, a much older example, and this is why King Kong is always getting remade. Because believe it or not, when King Kong originally released in 1933, that movie, while being a technological marvel and pushing the art of filmmaking forward, at least from a technological perspective, legitimately scared the shit out of people when it first released. I mean, people watching the original King Kong now are going to be scratching their heads and go, wait, this movie legitimately scared people when it released in theaters? Yes, just like those Universal monster movies. If you go back and watch The Mummy with Boris Karloff, okay, The Mummy legitimately scared people when it released in theaters. I believe back in 1931 is when The Mummy with Boris Karloff came out. And go back and watch that movie now, you're probably gonna be laughing your ass off, going really this legitimately scared people. And people forget that The Mummy was remade 4 times. 3 times. There were four quote unquote mummy movies. The first time it was remade was in the 1950s by Hammer, and it starred Christopher Lee as the Mummy, and Peter Cushing was the architect that uncovered the Mummy. Then the most famous remake of it came out with Brendan Fraser in 1999. I almost had a brain fart there. And then it was remade again in 2017 with Tom Cruise, and believe you me, we don't discuss the 2017 remake of The Mummy with Tom Cruise because that one is god-awful. But still, okay, the 1999 remake of The Mummy is so iconic that most people don't even know that the Brendan Fraser Mummy movie is actually the second remake of The Mummy. Like I said, it originally was with Boris Karloff back in 1931. Then it was remade in the 50s with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And then the Brendan Fraser movie, the third one in line, released in 1999. So basically what I'm getting at, because I've dragged this video out longer than it probably needed to go. So I'm going to end it off with this, okay? It's not just horror movies. It's not just horror movie reboots that are easy to justify or science fiction movies that are easy to justify. The types of remakes or reboots that are easy to justify are the ones that are the ones that come about due to changing technology. And there's a couple others that I could have brought up, but I didn't for the sake of time. Like All Quiet on the Western Front was actually remade a couple of times, because you could make the argument for how filmmaking technology was in 1931 by comparison to 1979 was night and day, and even the filmmaking technology of 1979 to 2023 or 2022 when the one on Netflix dropped, night and day. Or when you go back and you take an old movie and bring it up into modern times. One other example I could bring up at the end here is Beastly, that starred Alex Pettyfer and Jennifer Hudgens. I almost said Jennifer Hudson. No, sorry, Vanessa Hudgens. Why did I say Jennifer Hudgens? I was thinking Jennifer Hudson for a second. No, Alex Pettyfer and Vanessa Hudgens in Beastly. All Beastly was a contemporary remake of Beauty and the Beast. The only difference between Beastly and Beauty and the Beast is that instead of taking place in 18th century France, which is when Beauty and the Beast takes place, no, in Beastly it takes place in 2010's New York. That's it. That's all Beastly is. I mean, how many contemporary remake? Actually, no, that's a bad comparison. How many people even know that Hollow Man was starring Kevin Bacon, came out in 2000? How many people even knew that Hollow Man was in and of itself a remake of the Invisible Man? It was just set in late 90s, early 2000s, versus when the original book was written. I believe the original book was written late 1800s, early 1900s. I know it was first made. It was a Universal monster movie made in 1932, but the original book was written by H.G. Wells. But still, contemporary remakes have always existed, and those are the easiest to justify due to changing technology, due to the changing times, and due to the fact of, what was scary to one generation or what spoke to one generation is going to be tamed to another, or the message is going to get lost over the decades, because some of those science fiction films from the 1950s were made for the audiences of the 1950s. They were not made for audiences of the 2020s. So those remakes are going to be the easiest to justify, not when you go back and basically do a shoddy remake of Star Wars, but call it Star Wars Episode 7.